moderate our panel today in a new series called Dialogues on Democracy. I wanted to start by providing some background about the series. This programming was developed through the vision of the deans of Gonzaga University's academic units, who, like many of us, were appalled by the events of January 6th at the US Capitol. They felt it was important to reflect on these events, to draw on the expertise and knowledge of our faculty as we strive to learn about contributing factors, and to engage in a dialogue across our academic units and the university community. And this desire has led to our Dialogues on Democracy series. Today is our first event, and we will continue with future sessions in the next academic year. We have three distinguished speakers for you today. A quick point of order, I am going to introduce all three now and allow them to present. The last 20 minutes or so of our program will be reserved for audience questions and panelist interaction. Please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A feature. I'll be monitoring it throughout the session, and then we'll pose some of those questions to our panelists in that Q&A portion of our event. So now, to introduce our panelists, I will begin by introducing Joe Gardner, who is a professor in the Political Science Department. He specializes in American political institutions, teaching courses on constitutional law. His research focuses on deliberative decision-making. Next is Christina Morehouse from the Communications Studies Department. Professor Morehouse worked as a journalist for 11 years before she began teaching at Gonzaga. She teaches a variety of courses, including research methods, meaning making, identity, and graduate level writing. Her research interests include storytelling, media literacy, identity maintenance, and communication pedagogy in the multicultural classroom. And then we have Noralis Rodriguez-Coss, an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. Her interdisciplinary scholarship focuses on issues concerning gender violence, social constructions of gender and islands, feminist activism and public protests, and global perspectives on gender and transnational feminism. So with that, I will hand it over to Professor Gardner.
Thank you. So for starters, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, great. So to get us started, I will be briefly explaining some of the institutional foundations or the rules of the game that set the stage for what happened last January. More specifically, I'm going to be discussing several parts of our presidential election process that help us to better understand what brought about the January 6th attempted insurrection. So in the United States, electing the president is a lengthy, multi-step, and frankly, unnecessarily convoluted process. It is governed by provisions in the Constitution, by federal laws, and also laws in each of the 50 states. So we really do have a patchwork of rules covering how we select our presidents. The most important thing to keep in mind is that we utilize this odd, aberrant electoral college mechanism. It's frankly a mechanism that serves no useful purpose and in fact undermines American democracy. For our purposes here, I'm going to have us start by looking at the counting of votes that kicks into high gear on election day, this most recent election, November 3rd. The counting of votes should be relatively simple, but it is not. Without going into detail on the Electoral College, remember that it is not the popular vote alone that matters. Rather, we have decided to use the popular vote as a way of allocating votes in the Electoral College. It is then the Electoral College itself that actually selects the president. What is critical to understand here is that nearly all of the states, 48 of the states, have chosen, and it is a choice, to use winner-take-all systems for converting the popular vote into Electoral College votes. So within each state, at the state level, whichever candidate gets the most votes gets 100% of that state's votes in the Electoral College. So that means that then even in a very close election, say a 49-51 split, or even a closer election than that, the candidate with the most votes gets all of that state's Electoral College votes. Also recognize that states do not have to use winner-take-all. They could, and currently 2 states do, use other more proportional ways of converting the popular vote into Electoral College votes. So why am I talking about all this? Why does this matter to last fall's election and what happened ultimately on January 6th? Well, this is the reason candidates may sometimes fight over even very small numbers of votes. When a candidate calls for a recount or when they turn to the courts to challenge aspects of some count, it's not just about the small number of votes immediately at issue. Rather, it's that those small number of votes might well determine who gets all of the electoral college votes in a particular state. But that's only because states have chosen to use the winner-take-all system. This is why then last fall we saw intense fighting over the counting, the recounting of votes in some of the states. The winner-take-all rule within the Electoral College incentivizes these intense battles over state-level counts. So let me show you some data here. These are results from 4 states that turned out to have among the closest election outcomes in the 2020 presidential election. These are the final vote tallies as maintained by the FEC. And what we see here is that indeed in Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the campaigns were very, very tightly contested, and the outcomes was a very, very narrow margin of victory for Biden in each of these states. Trump's campaign took the closeness of these results in these states, as well as in some other states as well, as an opening to try to challenge state-level counting of the votes. So for example, if you look at this table, if the Trump campaign could have successfully challenged about 10,500 votes in Arizona, he would then have won all of Arizona's 11 electoral college votes rather than having lost all 11 of those electoral college votes. That's why we fight over small numbers of votes. Keep in mind, though, that while the results were indeed very close in some individual states, and this is what we see here, the overall national popular vote outcome reflects a clear and decisive Biden victory. That's what we see in this table. And if you study this table for a moment, you can better see the significance of the winner-take-all system. This table shows that if instead the national popular vote was used to directly choose the president, then there would have been no rationale for challenging the votes in those 4 states. It just wouldn't have mattered. You could have done it, but if going back one slide here, even if Trump had picked up successfully challenged in Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, that would have hardly budged the needle on Biden's 7+ million vote margin at the national level. Looking as well here at the final column in this table, the same could be said of proportional allocation systems. If states instead chose to use proportional schemes to convert the popular vote into electoral college votes, then again, the challenges would have been pointless. Trump might have picked up 4 or 5 or 6 more electoral college votes, but that's a very small number in comparison to the 74 vote margin that Biden maintained there. Finally, also do keep in mind that pretty much without exception, Trump's many legal challenges were without merit. Factually, the state vote counts were proceeding smoothly and according to the rules in each state. Factually, voter fraud is a myth. So in sum, this seemingly simple winner-take-all rule that's a product of the Electoral College sets us up for this intense fighting over state-level election results. The general election was November 3rd. Each state wrapped up their counting by mid-December. The electors in each state then got together and voted, and the state results were sent on to the Senate. This then became the focus of our attention. On January 6th, the newly seated Senate, led by the president of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, counts the votes. Normally, in a normal year, this would just be a formality, simply finalizing the already known election outcomes that had been previously announced by the states. In most election years, we do not hear anything about this. It is simply not newsworthy. I've been teaching American politics for about 20 years. I have never spoken about the January 6th count because it just is not significant. Let me show you the relevant constitutional language. Read that. This provision does not appear to give discretionary power to the Congress to influence the election outcome. But there's more to this story. There are ways that this formality might sometimes come into play, and I'm going to discuss one of those here. There, in fact, are limited grounds written into federal law allowing members of Congress to challenge state results as they are being counted in the Senate. Specifically, under federal law, Congress can reject certain electoral college votes if they determine them to be not regularly given, or if a state's results were not lawfully certified. That's about all the law says. And if that language sounds unclear, that's because it is. This was an 1887 law. It was badly written. Attorneys continue to debate vigorously what exactly it means and how we should apply it. Nonetheless, it is generally agreed that it is that by this law, there is very little basis for challenging election results. This provision has been very rarely invoked in something over 130 years prior to this most recent election. It was used only twice to challenge electoral college votes. Neither challenge succeeded. There are as well other provisions in this same law that further limit the ability of members of Congress to challenge results. And I won't go into those now. So while there is a legal mechanism in place that allows for the challenging of votes on January 6th, it is very, very limited. Now, having said that, and this is what is important, there is nothing in this last step to prevent members of Congress from registering baseless objections. And that is what 147 members of Congress did on January 6th. So in sum then, this law, in conjunction with the vagueness of the Constitution, created another opening for a final challenge to the November 3rd election. Some people, Donald Trump included, seem to think that the Congress could reject some state results or creatively count results under this constitutional provision such that Biden would have been denied a victory. This mere formality became then the target of a violent attempted insurrection. And there is some real irony here in that this count really is of such little consequence. So to conclude here, I just make a final general observation from the perspective of political science. The lesson in all of this is that the rules of the game do matter. We need to understand those rules if we want to understand political behavior, including what transpired on January 6th. So I will wrap up there.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Gardner. We will next hear from Professor Morehouse.
Okay. Thank you. So, like many Americans on January 5th, I was recovering from the albeit subdued holiday season, pretending to class prep for the coming semester while working on a list for our target run and ruminating on what I should be fixing for dinner. Getting up for yet another cup of coffee, I wandered through the family room to find the television turned to a 24-hour news station. As luck should have it, I arrived just in time to see the breaching of the US Capitol. For the next several hours, I was transfixed. I knew protests were planned for that day, even threats from bombastic Congress members about trying to stop the election certification. But this was something wholly different than anything I expected. And it was clear from the coverage, the journalists covering the events were nearly as confused as I was. Unlike me, watching from the safety of my couch, they were trying to make sense of an event while those involved were literally threatening their lives. As a communications scholar and former journalist, I am forever entranced by the ways news is covered, the lenses or frames used to interpret events that set agendas for how we, the reading and viewing public, in turn interpret and respond. This is what we study. Individuals outside of academic settings rarely have time to explore that power of naming, the long-standing impact of representation. That representation, argues cultural theorist Stuart Hall, is an essential part of the process by which meaning is produced and exchanged between members of culture. Journalists, for good and for bad, are constantly engaged in making meaning for their audiences. As I watched the Capitol breach, I had so many questions. How could this be happening? Where were the police with rubber bullets and tear gas I had seen at the Black Lives Matter gatherings I attended last summer? And most doggedly, what exactly was happening? Certainly the journalists on the scene weren't sure as they struggled to name the event. Was it a protest, a riot, a mob, a siege, a violent occupation, an insurrection, a coup? As broadcast reporter Al Thompson wrote in mid-January for the widely respected think tank, the Poynter Institute, journalists must take seriously how and what they name something, the representation and meaning making to which theorist Hall refers. The Associated Press style book, A Journalism Guide, asks journalists to consider the reasons people are engaged in a protest, even a violent one, before deciding how to name it. And I think therein lies the issue surrounding the naming of events at the Capitol on that fateful day. Throughout the 4 years of the Trump administration, journalists were under near constant assault. While politicians launching verbal attacks on the press aren't new, think Nixon, the vitriol from Trump and in turn his supporters had reached peak levels, turning the press from the fourth estate into the opposition. Trump routinely referred to reporters as the enemy of the people and referred to their work as fake news. Supporters showed up at Trump rallies wearing t-shirts that read "Rope Tree Journalist, some assembly required." By the way, these beauties were sold at Walmart. According to an article by Poynter, in Trump's January 5th speech to supporters before they moved on the Capitol, he referred to journalists as the biggest problem we have as far as I'm concerned. He reiterated, single biggest problem. During the breach, someone scratched "murder the media" into the door inside the Capitol. In this dangerous milieu, journalists have struggled to cover the news as objectively as possible. From the day Trump announced his candidacy, gliding down that golden escalator at Trump Tower, journalists have engaged in hand-wringing over how to talk about Trump's penchant for falsehood. Can we call it a lie if we don't know his intent? It was not until 2019, 3 years into his term, that reporters routinely began to call him a liar. And if you're counting, the Washington Post tallied 30,537 lies or misleading claims during his presidency, with nearly half of those coming in the last year. What developed in the interim led to a kind of entrenched hesitancy in the part of journalists when making any claim about him or his followers and their activities for fear of reprisal, both verbal and physical, and with good reason. On the day of the Capitol breach, journalists hid in legislative offices with Congress members while the Trump supporters filled the hallways. Journalists were chased, their equipment broken, they were spit upon. A noose made from a camera cord hung from a nearby tree. One female journalist was called a slut and a whore. And while journalists are certainly accustomed to harassment, understanding that it comes with their work, those on the scene at the Capitol say this was wholly different. At least 9 journalists were physically assaulted, according to the US press tracker, Freedom Tracker. As one journalist told Poynter, there was so much anger, and that anger was feeding off of itself. People were looking for someone to bear the brunt of that anger, and unfortunately, the media was a very obvious target. Amidst this clearly palpable fear, journalists were struggling to frame for their audiences what was happening at the Capitol on that day because it kept changing. It started as a rally, moved to a vocal protest, then on to people crawling through broken windows, defacing statues, and defecating in the hallways. Journalists captured protesters inside the Capitol watching the news on their phone as the events unfolded. Each word journalists summoned came with a certain amount of verbal baggage, a kind of you name it, you own it yoke. In October 2020, after months of sustained protest over Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, The AP style book urged reporters to use care in deciding which term best applies. A riot is a wild or violent disturbance of the peace involving a group of people. The term riot suggests uncontrolled chaos and pandemonium, and often has been used to stigmatize people fighting for justice. Unrest is a vaguer, milder, and less emotional term for a condition of angry discontent and protest, verging on revolt. Into this struggle over words marched the events of the Capitol. Journalists were well aware of the social reality through characterization they created that day would forever be compared to the summer protests over Floyd's murder. As Tompkins wrote in that January Pointer article, journalists have an obligation to use language that shows neither fear nor favor. As the events on January 6th took shape, reporters knew whatever choice they made, their decisions were fraught. They began by using the word protest, but as the incident grew more violent, switched to stronger words such as mob and riot. But as the incident, but as the incident grew, okay. In a postmortem, sorry, got a little lost there. In a postmortem article, editors for the AP said they quickly began telling reporters that protest was far too mild, that the event had expanded to meet the news organization's standard of uncontrolled chaos, and they could use the word riot. Editors already cleared insurrection and mob. At the same time, they cautioned against coup as having the potential to be overly dramatic. And I have to say, I can't help thinking about how reporters were trying to make these choices while people screamed at them, spit on them, and threatened their lives. By the next day, most news organizations had arrived at insurrection as the preferred term, defined by Merriam-Webster as a violent act or instance of revolt against civil authorities or an established government. Attempted coup was scrapped for its militaristic overtones, while domestic terrorism remains in play to this day. On January 12th, CNN ran an article that offered readers detailed definitions for all these terms: insurrection, coup, and sedition. Even then, as theorist Hall would say, the struggle over meaning persisted. The conservative website Red State pushed back against the term insurrection, running an article headlined "Enough. There was no riot, insurrection, or storming of the Capitol," although a day later, the article was removed from the site for factual errors, among other things. Another conservative website, Big League Politics, described the insurrection as a historic civil rights march by President Donald Trump's supporters. Days after the event at the Capitol, journalists spoke openly in articles and on television about how frightened they were during the siege. The 4 years of the Trump presidency had already rattled the press as an institution, and the insurrection only served to further embed that sense of instability. While fraught with error and systemic issues, journalists remain critical to the functioning of the state. They must do their best to be careful and thoughtful, focusing more on fairness than unobtainable objectivity. Communication theorist James Carey talks about the way in which communication creates social reality, and each day, journalists are engaged in this construction. The words they chose on January 5th matter. Naming matters, because these words will be used for years, even centuries to come. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Professor Rodriguez-Coss.
Thank you. Okay, as a feminist scholar, my interest will be focused on gender and its relationship to the events of January 6th. I will highlight research addressing this topic from multiple disciplines and perspectives. Recent publications on gender and behavioral sciences have expanded the scholarship about the manifestations of patriarchy in the political domain. Specifically, the field on gender psychology have made direct correlations between masculinity and the events of January 6th. So to what extent are gender politics and the events of January 6th connected? Political scientist Rose McDermott published last year an article titled "The Role of Gender in Political Violence." McDermott states the following, and I quote, "Conventional models of international relations that seek to explain the origins and impact of political violence typically ignore issues of gender and tend to focus instead of forces such as regime type, economic development, or religion to explain the reasons for conflict. Yet there is no factor more important for understanding the sources of consequences of political violence than gender. End of quote. McDermott goes on to explain how political ideology is organized around common values, some of which revolve around privilege and dominance. Such systems of domination and subordination benefit high status men, whose power depends on the political and economic structures that subordinate women and that control most of the population, including men. Most scholars point out that masculinity is a yet underexplored determinant of political behavior. Since 2016 to 2020, the importance of conservative politics that the administration in turn at the time gave to their political image and performance became a rich area of academic investigation, particularly the exploration of certain behaviors in relationship to people's support of certain policies and politicians. The field of political psychology, for example, has made great contributions to the understanding of psychological origins of political attitudes, ideologies, and behavior. This field has identified a range of factors for political support, including personality traits, racial attitudes, economic stressors, and intergroup dynamics, among others. On the other hand, masculinity studies in fields such as women and gender studies, as well as gender psychology and sociology, examines prevailing cultural expectations of manhood to which men are expected to conform. This includes social acceptable characteristics of masculinity in the United States, including status seeking, achievement, and success in work and sports, competitiveness, aggression, and the abstention from femininity in behavior, speech, and emotion. Research on precarious manhood by psychologists Joseph Bandello and Jennifer Bosson suggests that compared with womanhood, which is conventionally viewed as a resulting from a natural, permanent, and biological developmental transition, manhood must be earned, demonstrated, and maintain their status as quote-unquote real men. Manhood as precarious has been advanced by social psychologists Sarah DiMuccio and Eric Knowles in their article, The Political Significance of Fragile Masculinity, published in 2019, in which they argue that in many males, the pressure to earn and prove their manhood triggers anxiety that in turn motivates a variety of compensatory beliefs and behaviors, which they call fragile masculinity, meaning the anxiety that stems from manhood's precariousness and the behavioral consequences of this anxiety. It is highlighted that while both men and women face pressure to abide by their culture's prevailing gender norms, a man's failure to adhere to masculine expectations is especially threatening because it can lead not only to ostracism or a loss of esteem in the eyes of peers, but to the revocation of his very membership in the high status of man category. It has been reported that the consequences of fragile masculinity comes mostly from experimental studies designed to reduce men's confidence in their manhood. An example is by insinuating that participants are heavily feminine, which is one of the most prevailing US cultural standards that men are demanded or supposed to avoid. Among the reactions observed from these studies, men present anxiety-related thoughts, gender role-related stress, greater toughness, increased alcohol consumption, and more aggressivity toward gay men. DiMuccio and Knowles link these reactions to politics and elections by associating them to increase justification of social inequality, less support of gender equality, more benevolent sexism, more homophobic attitudes, and increased enjoyment of sexist and anti-gay humor. They state and I quote, "In the context of politics, masculine stances and policies are those that convey toughness, aggression, and risk tolerance." End of quote. And a small number of studies provide empirical evidence that masculine concerns do in fact drive political opinions and outcomes. Sociological, psychological, and public opinion research indicate important differences in terms of political desires and views. That research reveals that in comparison to women, men tend to be attracted to policies that encourage force, military aggression, and violence, for example, death penalty and war. Dimosho and Knowles mentioned that fragile masculinity might compound the partisan gender gap and most robust gender differences due to the use of force issues. Comparatively, psychologists Teresa Beccio and Nathaniel Skemmerhorn published in January of this year the article titled "Hegemonic Masculinity Predicts 2016 and 2020 Voting and Candidate Evaluations." Based on the findings of 7 studies involving over 2,000 people, this investigation found that men's and women's endorsement of hegemonic masculinity, and by hegemonic masculinity meaning practices that legitimizes men's dominance position in society, predicted support for Trump over and beyond the aforementioned factors, even when controlling for political party affiliation. Results highlight the importance of looking beyond social identity based conceptualizations of masculinity to fully consider how men and women's endorsement of cultural ideologies about masculinity legitimate patriarchal forms of dominance and reify gender, race, and class-based hierarchies. If we are familiarized with Trump's speech of January 6th, that included phrases such as "fight like hell," and efforts to ridicule other men, such as Brian Kemp saying that he weighs 130 pounds and that Kemp say he played offensive line in football, and later saying, "I'm trying to figure that out. I'm still trying to figure that out." He said that the other night, "I was an offensive lineman." I'm saying, really, that must have been a very small team. This is also an article in NPR described the crowd as laughing appreciatively to this speech, right? Especially after this comment. So we see here the weak and strong dichotomy in which enforcing or framing weakness as a center theme that is endorsing prevalent male characteristics of dominance. Images of this day also show male-identified participants targeting the offices of female politicians, such as the office of Nancy Pelosi. One man, identified as Richard Barnett, was photographed sitting at Pelosi's desk and later bragged about stealing a piece of her mail, saying, "I wrote her a nasty note, put my feet up on her desk, and scratched my balls," according to the New York Times' Matthew Rosenberg. These 2 examples and many others that can be considered in which macho performance play a big role to not only dominate others, but also to demonstrate embodiment, right? Embodying their membership in the high status, quote unquote, man category already mentioned. I also want to connect this back to McDermott, who I mentioned earlier. She says that asymmetries in power operate to perpetuate systems that harm women, children, and the majority of men, and increase rates of domestic and political violence. Based on this research and from a social justice perspective, while patriarchal gender paradigms aren't shifted in our society, along with other forms of oppression, such as racism, classism, what is at stake is the lives and freedom of many of us that has been historically marginalized, and even those that benefit from certain privileges, including white men that do not belong to the elite. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to chat into the Q&A box any of your questions, and we will incorporate it into our discussion. And I would actually like to begin with a question for Professor Gardner. When you're sort of discussing this idea that the process matters, the rule matters here, what avenues do we have then for protecting the process? Is it doing away with the all or nothing system, electoral college, ways of perhaps making sure Congress cannot make baseless challenges? What are some of the avenues for protecting us from this in the future?
Good question. Yeah, one of them immediately, the Electoral Count Vote Act of 1887 is in dire need of updating. It fleshes out aspects of this process, the final steps of the process of transitioning from the popular vote through the electoral college vote to ultimately the inauguration of a new president. So there's one thing, and I believe there has been discussion of that since this January 6th. I do not know whether anybody is actually moving on bills to do that. I'm one of many political scientists who has long been advocating for doing away with the electoral college or finding effectively some way to do away with it. That might be beyond the scope of this discussion to more thoroughly discuss how the electoral college works, what the problems are with it. I highlighted just one small slice of what the problems with it might be. To most effectively deal with that would involve a constitutional amendment. There are other ways that we can get around some, if not all, of the problems with the electoral college short of actual constitutional amendment. So procedures that would be, politically speaking, more doable.
And then, so I guess as a follow-up question, do you think, and I guess in your opinion, have we established sort of a dangerous precedent of these challenges? And, you know, you mentioned January 6th was an insignificant date in the process before. Are we going to see these creative avenues, let's say generously creative avenues for undermining democracy?
Yeah, I wonder about that a lot. I mean, talking about dangerous precedents, we had 4+ solid years of daily dangerous precedents being set before the January 20th inauguration of Joe Biden. And so we could go on with pages and pages and pages of very sad and dangerous precedents that were set. But yeah, specifically since November 3rd, again, the challenges, I started by explaining why, because of the winner-take-all system, it incentivizes battling over small numbers of votes. On the other hand, that's not to say that there were legitimate grounds for challenging the results in those 4 states, as well as other states that the Trump campaign focused on as well. And so in that respect, they're setting a frightening precedent with the freeness with which they challenged results just because they didn't like what the people said at the ballot box. That itself is not a ground for challenging the results, but that seems to be the only reason that was truly behind the motivations, that truly motivated them to challenge those results. And then, yeah, as you're saying on the January 6th vote count process, yeah, it's concerning that the precedent was set there. The 147 members of the House and the Senate were willing to sign on to objections to the vote results from various states, despite the fact that those vote results had been legally certified in their states. And so we might well question what is going to come a little less than 4 years from now, and on and on.
Wonderful. Well, I will welcome any other panelist contributions to that question before moving on to any others.
I have just one. In my research for this presentation, one of the things I kept coming across was how it's forever changed the term peaceful transfer of power, because this was a first, right? And so how do we always just kind of accepted that as being part of what happened that day, and it wasn't what happened that day. And so there's just our language is going to change around that event most likely. So
yeah, so I will ask the next question to Professor Rodriguez-Coss from our chat here. We have a question asking, do you feel that all hegemonic norms and practices in the performance of masculinity need to be transformed, or are there specific norms, habits, or practices that need to be addressed through a critical and skeptical lens?
I think the problem mostly is around those forms of masculinities that are associated mostly with power and control, right? And hierarchies. So there are many masculinities that we can think about, right? And that often confront or challenge hegemonic masculinity. So there is no one way of being masculine, right? Or to identify as a masculine person. But the problem is around these social constructs, right? That tend to be designed for the control and power over others. And so we have to then keep in mind, right, that other folks that identify as male people or masculine are also working to transform those forms of gender identities.
Hey, thank you. And for Professor Morehouse, then, can you characterize how the naming of the January 6th insurrection may have shifted or developed as used by various constituents in the time that has elapsed since January 6th?
It's been very interesting how journalists have kind of adapted. I think I would argue that they've mostly waited to see how law enforcement is now addressing it. I mean, there are charges of sedition being brought up. They're referring to it as an insurrection, definitely a riot and a rebellion. But I think that many of the terms they arrived on that day tend to be the ones they're staying with, as long as they meet, because a lot of them have very legalistic terminology attached to them. And the one that they've kind of struggled with is whether it qualifies as domestic terrorism. And the FBI itself is struggling with whether to call it domestic terrorism or not. And so I think they're mostly trying to I mean, most of the articles I'm seeing today are talking more about insurrection and charges of sedition and even staying away, I would say, from riot at this point, because they're moving more into the legalistic terms of what happened that day. And it seems like that's where they're landing most of the time. In recent articles, it's definitely referred over and over as an insurrection. But I was curious because Joe was calling it attempted. And I'm wondering about that. You talked about attempted insurrection, so I'm curious if I'm missing a legalistic.
No, I suppose I was just getting an attempted overthrow of government.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
An attempt to subvert
Right.
the legal process specified by the Constitution.
Yeah. But one of the things I can say is that because there's so much going on about you're calling it this thing here, but you're not calling it this thing here, journalists are really, I talked in my speech about the kind of hesitancy. I think that the 4 years of the Trump administration made them much more, and then the George Floyd protests over the summer really created with journalists much more hesitancy about how to name things. And I think in many ways that's a good thing, but I also fear that they get a little caught up in that and are almost fearful of reporting what they're seeing happening, because honesty doesn't necessarily work in the kind of partisan disputes that we're seeing right now. Honest, I mean, like the conservative websites that said it was a civil rights march, right? So there's a lot of different ways of viewing what you saw happen that day.
And I suppose one follow-up question that I would have on that is, how do journalists balance telling the story when they're actively a part of it? Because I feel like they're pulled into as a character, not merely a reporter.
Yeah, I you know, that's such a good question. And it's one that I struggled with as a reporter. And I know that they clearly were struggling with that day. And objectivity, when your life is threatened, is not necessarily a lens through which you can see things. And so I think a lot of it was in consultation with others about what they could kind of agree on as a group about what they were seeing and talking to their editors. But certainly the lens was so distorted by all that was happening to them at the time. And you have to wonder whether some of their judgment was in fact clouded, like somebody's taking your camera equipment away. The stories are just amazing. People chasing them down the hallways, taking their equipment and breaking it. And very little intervention from police to protect journalists at that time as well. So I think a lot of it is kind of sitting on your hands and waiting to be able to make some sort of judgment.
Well, we have a question in the chat from Professor Truthart from the law school. So the Academy of Arts and Sciences, through its own Common Purpose initiative in 2020, made several recommendations for reinventing American democracy. Have any of you been involved in those efforts? And then specifically for Professor Gardner, should reinventing democracy be our goal? And if so, apart from the Electoral College reform, what other steps can realistically be taken? So fix democracy for us.
I've not been a part of it. Well, I guess a short way of answering this is the comments, what steps could realistically be taken? Realistically, the change we need is going to be very, very, very difficult to achieve. That's the way our system has been set up. Political scientists can fairly easily identify, I don't know what it is, 5, 6, or 7 big changes that we need in our institutions, in our Constitution, that could shore up, could strengthen American democracy. But we freely admit that really none of those are easily accomplished. Frankly, reforming the Electoral College is probably the easiest. A huge impediment to the achievement of democracy, genuine democracy in this country, is the equal apportionment of votes in the Senate among the states. But that's going to be very, very difficult to change. We need to address questions of redistricting in the House of Representatives and the partisan gerrymandering that goes on there. That leads to deviations from representative democracy. Campaign finance reform, a movement towards a system where truly every person has an equal say in the outcomes of American democracy. Some of these are maybe not entirely without of reach, but none of them would be easy, frankly.
Well, I'm happy to at least hear that there are consortiums of people working on it, not merely politicians working on it. So we have a question actually asking about QAnon, specifically an HBO documentary, but even more generally, how do you assess the role of social media and what can be done to mitigate its influence? I'm going to keep my moderator hat on, but I think this is a fantastic question personally as a social media scholar. So what do you think about social media's role in things like these fast-moving conspiracy theories like QAnon? I think that's open to, I think it sort of really touches on everyone's topic.
It's an area I have less expertise in, so I might let others go first.
Well, it is not my area of expertise, but I love popular culture, and and so some of the things that I was observing that day and that I read about during that time was about the narrative and the impact of the images that it had in many people, right? Particularly, I remember reading about how it triggered many survivors of violence, and how these images are not are new in a way, right? To the media spectrum of the United States. Others framing the United States as that this needed to stop because it was not a third world country. And so in many ways, I highlight that critique, right, about US sense of superiority and national superiority in relationship to other countries in the world, and how much of a slap that was to Puerto Ricans struggling after Hurricane Maria and many other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we have, right, different, if we look at it from different perspectives, we see not only of the newness of people seeing violence at a level that they thought never would happen, but the little discussion, I think, in social media that many other people from different countries were kind of like highlighting of how much of the US government participation have taken in other countries' attempts against their democracy. So that will be my response.
What I would add is that the 4 years of the Trump administration created such a distrust of the media, and people turned to social media to do a lot of, QAnon took root. I mean, it had roots before that, but it certainly burgeoned during that time. And that what I would say is that it does play a role. In fact, as it was happening, many people who were involved in the siege were tweeting out about what was happening to them, and kind of a sense of, look where I am, I'm in Nancy Pelosi's office. And so this kind of, we want to think of it as democratization, but also there's no filter, right? And so it just builds and builds, and the distrust in mainstream media sources that to fact checking, there's issues that could be addressed, but they certainly have certain standards they get to. Social media has been a huge outlet for a lot of conspiracy to grow and not have a lot of pushback against. And so it has further kind of disenfranchised some professional journalists, and at the same time made them, once again, as I talked about in the presentation, kind of distrustful of their own instincts, because they know that there will be response from people on social media that will call them out and say they're lying. And so it's created this really interesting situation, as well as the fact that journalists in general need to do some post-mortem on their own behavior during the Trump administration, because back to the point of kind of letting things get away from, well, for one thing, the news cycle was unlike anything we had ever experienced before, right? It just was constant. And then I think because of that, there was a sense that they weren't digging deep into things, but it was like putting out a fire every day. And so I think that into that void came a lot of social media that was distrustful. So I don't know if that addresses it, but at least it talks about some of the issue associated with it.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask one final audience question of Professor Rodriguez-Coss, and then sort of a concluding question for the other panelists. So what can we do to help lessen the gap between genders within politics at the Capitol, like you had discussed? And along with this, what do you think let it get to that point and where it is today?
As I mentioned in the conclusion, ideally shifting these gender paradigms that exist about what women should be or what men should be, right? And so I think in big part, many of our courses in Gonzaga address this and help our students to start thinking critically about questioning their own gender roles and their own gender behaviors and their own gender identities, right? So one first step is to question gender identities and why we do what we do, right? As women, as men, and the impact that these gender roles and gender paradigms has over many it has a huge effect on how we think, who we support, and how we participate in the elections, how we love others, right? So it impacts us in all our social, personal, intimate, and public life. So it is a good way to start getting a moment of self-reflection and questioning how we perform our masculinity, our femininity, and to maybe expand those boxes in which we are located, right? That gender binary. So we are more than female and male, and expand those categories to understand who we are as human beings and the many things that we can do with that information.
Well, perfect. And I guess along those same lines then, briefly for the other panelists, how do we sort of forge a path forward for our audience? What can we all do to I guess, continue dialogues in democracy or otherwise?
Well, not to sound trite, but you can vote regularly. If you can, make the extra effort and get involved in volunteering to help register other people to vote, encouraging friends and family to vote, participating in Get Out the Vote drives. I hope it's becoming more apparent, and I think it is becoming more apparent to more people that voting really does matter.
Excellent. Professor Morehouse.
I would say support good journalism and look for sources that are reliable and do not, I mean, I've done it myself where I've retweeted something and then it's like, oh, wait a minute. So be really careful about the choices you make and what information you put out there, and make sure they're reliable sources of information.
Well, excellent. Well, with that, we are at the end of our program. So I want to thank everybody who attended. I want to really thank our panelists for their wonderful presentations and insights. We will be continuing this series, Dialogues on Democracy, in the fall. So please stay tuned for additional programming. And thank you to our deans for facilitating our all coming together. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.